Dealing with Book 7 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. A lot of material to be covered in this brilliant analysis, so I'm going to get right into it. Having finished defining and considering intellectual and moral virtues, Aristotle starts to talk about incontinence, an imperfect moral state, and continence, continence being close to moral virtue. He does this, St. Thomas says, to ensure he has not overlooked any issue related to moral activity that needs to be considered. His procedure now is to study progressively worse stages of moral decline related to vice, from incontinence to intemperance to brutishness, states of moral practice we need to avoid. Since intemperance and brutishness are kinds of vice, and incontinence gets close to it, his study starts with a definition of vice. To determine a right definition of vice, he starts by noting that a good moral act is a synthesis of right reason and right desire. A disordered relationship between these two faculties can cause an act to become morally vicious. If a disorder in the relation is partial so that reason still remains right, incontinence results. If the disorder is total, the result will be vice, intemperance. Right? St. Thomas says that the incontinent person is not vicious because while the appetitive faculty of the incontinent man is disordered, the desire for reason to remain right remains in this person. In the vicious person, the disordered appetitive faculty dominates reason so much that reason voluntarily follows the end pursued by the disordered appetite as a first principle, an ultimate end. Consequently, an evil person performing evil acts with complete voluntariness by choice is the result. The consequence of such viciousness eventually is brutishness, because the natural inclination of a human being to take direction from right reason is destroyed. St. Thomas says, just as physical illness results in a person from improper proportion in metabolic agents, poor digestion, generating toxic chemicals in the body, my analysis of what he's saying, that creates a disordered bodily temperature. Bad eating habits destroy physical health. Just as that happens, so a disordered appetite that disorders the harmonious relation between reason and appetite causes a human being to degenerate to the level of a brute. A rightly ordered appetite, right desire, preserves the natural harmony between the faculties toward which by nature all human beings are inclined. In one way, St. Thomas adds, moral disharmony of this kind can happen without destroying a person's ability to order choice like a normal human being. A partial moral disharmony, even of the extreme kind like a vice, will not so corrupt human desire so that it will resemble that of a brute. Total moral corruption, brutishness, however, St. Thomas says, is so extreme that the result is analogous to a man's body being changed into that of a lion or a pig. Contrary to these morally disordered states, St. Thomas lists for brutishness the opposite virtue of heroic or divine virtue, for incontinence that of continence, and for vice that of virtue. He lists three ways of becoming brutish: through disorder caused by bad laws, psychological or physical illness, and habitually becoming more vicious. After giving this general introduction to the devolution of human beings from virtue to vice, Aristotle starts to talk about incontinence. He considers incontinence, perseverance, and being morally irresolute, weak in the face of pleasure and pain. He commends continence when concerned with pleasure and perseverance also when concerned with pain, but claims that neither is a virtue. Then he concludes his introduction to the study of incontinence and continence by noting its essential limitations, saying that he will proceed in his usual way, that is the arguments, the study has limitations. He is saying that he will proceed in his usual way regarding ethical matters by stating what appears probable. He maintains that in moral matters we cannot explain everything. The best we can do is start by stating what appears probable, And when difficulties arise, resolve the questions we can. Doing this will help us to identify the most probable, most likely solutions to the problems. Proceeding in this way, he presents six probable statements about continence, incontinence, perseverance, prudence, and temperance. That continence and perseverance are good, incontinence, irresoluteness are bad. The continent man appears prudent, the incontinent man appears imprudent. The continent man knows particular acts are evil and avoids doing them because of reason. The incontinent man does the opposite. The temperate man appears continent and persevering. Some people say that the prudent man cannot be incontinent and is godlike. Sometimes people who get angry or pursue honor and gain are called incontinent. According to St. Thomas, the proper way to consider a subject of study involves 6 steps. To consider it generally, then specifically, in its proper nature. The acts its proper nature generates, the way it specifically acts. Then to compare it to beings the same as it, then to beings different from it, and then to consider it in relationship to its external surroundings. The type of procedure in which Aristotle and St. Thomas tend to engage in this work. He mentions this because Aristotle, in answering these objections, will not follow the same order in which they are presented. For example, he starts to respond to the objection 3 that where his procedure deals with the continent man. It doesn't address the first probable claim, that continence and perseverance are good and incontinence and irresoluteness are bad. Okay. Instead, it deals with the question of the continent man knowing particular acts are evil and because of reason refraining to do them. The kind of argument presented by Socrates. The incontinent man knows that they are evil by reason and does them anyway. As Aristotle attributes this position to Socrates, claiming that to know the good is to do the good, which appears to make the vice a kind of ignorance, and incontinence impossible. Aristotle answers Socrates as follows. Evident is that some people do what they know is wrong. If the incontinent men only commit vicious acts when under the appetite of influence, studying this influence is helpful, because without it the incontinent man is continent. Aristotle next rejects the argument given by some to salvage the teaching of Socrates. The incontinent man acts under the influence of opinion, they say, not knowledge, because such a person has either weak or strong opinion. If strong opinion, not knowledge, then he's blameworthy as other people who do what they know is wrong. If his opinion is weak, the action of the incontinent man appears not to be blameworthy, not to be a vice. So they switch the position from that of acting under knowledge to that of opinion. As far as the claim that a prudent man cannot be incontinent, Aristotle considers this objection. Even though prudence directs him toward virtue, that is, right reason directs him towards virtue, the prudent man can be incontinent if he has a strong opinion contending against evil desires, because prudence is the strongest of opinions. For 2 reasons, Aristotle rejects this claim, or this argument. First, it would allow a prudent man simultaneously to be prudent and incontinent, and it appears impossible because it would declare performance of the basest actions to be prudent, a virtue. The second reason is that the prudent man rightly judges the individual act in the individual situation, knows the right principle of means, but also has all the other moral virtues, knows the right principles about ends. In short, the prudent man is totally virtuous. Next, Aristotle presents several arguments against the probable claim that the temperate man appears continent, persevering, by saying, a man is called continent because his reason does not succumb to vehement evil desires. If this is true, the temperate man will not be continent, nor the continent man temperate, because the virtuous man is temperate. has no evil, vehement desires, but the continent man does. If the temperate man has no vehement evil desires, he cannot be continent, because the continent man has such desires and conquers them. If he were continent and had evil desires, and the continent man had good, not evil desires, some kinds of continence would be undesirable, would be incontinence. If the evils the continent man resists are not vehement, resisting them, moreover, requires no virtue. Turning to objections against his probable claim that the continent man appears prudent while the incontinent man appears imprudent, Aristotle presents these arguments. A continent man lives by reason, but a man who lives by reason is irresolute, because he's open to be persuaded by every opinion, not to reject any, to be tolerant of all opinions. But since an opinion can be false, and since what is false is evil, some kind of continence is evil, cannot be prudent. Aristotle here is presenting several arguments given by sophists against his teaching, or against his claims. At this point, Aristotle adds objections to the claim that the incontinent man is imprudent by saying, if incontinence abandons every opinion of reason, including conjectures, wild opinions, and sophistry, some kind of incontinence is good, but incontinence should always be condemned as evil. If to abandon every opinion sometimes is good, and at times incontinence is good, imprudence joined to incontinence at times is good, and virtue will be a synthesis of two vices, which is impossible, the two vices of incontinence and imprudence. After answering objections to his claim that continence and perseverance are good, and incontinence and irresoluteness are bad, Aristotle makes the following statements. The person who performs evil actions because he is persuaded they are good, and chooses pleasures as good in themselves, is better than the person who chooses evil acts because of incontinence, not because of bad reasoning. The person who has to be persuaded to misbehave appears to be more corrigible than the incontinent man who needs no persuasion because he can also be dissuaded by reason. The viciously incontinent man does not incline to listen to reason, cannot be helped by any good advice. He cites this proverb: the good water of advice chokes, does not refresh him. To the objection that he wants to extend incontinence to those who need persuasion, he says, no one will then be continent without qualification. He does not do so, because if he did, no one would be continent without qualification. But we do call some people incontinent as a separate species of vice, absolutely incontinent. Finally, regarding his claim that sometimes people who get angry, pursue honor, gain, are also called incontinent, he says he will solve these doubts by showing that some tend to make mistakes, which causes them, for example, to become angry, and he can omit some of these claims as already solved, and he can find out the truth about others. In Lesson 3, after going over all of these objections, St. Thomas considers Aristotle's final resolution to his doubts about these claims regarding continence and incontinence. By returning to Socrates' contention, which appeared to be that incontinence cannot exist, prefacing his answer by saying that to answer this question, he must resolve the question whether continence and incontinence actually exist. To resolve this question, Aristotle says he must consider the kinds of pleasures about which a man can be continent and incontinent, and whether continence relates to all or some pleasures. Since continence, perseverance are not totally identical, St. Thomas considers whether they differ specifically regarding some common matter, whether they are species of a common genus, or whether they differ only in the way they deal with some matters. To answer these questions, St. Thomas notes that Aristotle distinguishes between continence in an unqualified sense and continence in a qualified sense. Then he says a person is continent, can be continent or incontinent regarding some limited subject and in relation to the way he conducts himself toward the limited subject. The incontinent man pursues the pleasurable object when present, but not in the same way as the intemperate man, who reasons it wrong to choose, but chooses it anyway. Appetitively, the incontinent man cannot help himself, is appetitively weak. St. Thomas adds that this argument holds whether the cognition that generates incontinence is knowledge or opinion. For some people are as tenaciously led by false opinion as they are by knowledge. The example Aristotle gives is that of Heraclitus wagging his finger because he had become so convinced that everything was constantly changing that talking was useless. Habitually, we human beings know in two ways. By having a habit and not presently using it, and by having a habit and presently using it. For a man to act contrary to what he knows is hard to understand, St. Thomas says, what he presently knows, but what he habitually knows but not consider is easy to understand. Since practical reason uses two modes of judging, universal reason and particular, no problem exists in understanding how a person can habitually know in both ways, but in the individual instance only consider the universal way of judging and not the particular. And here's where the psychological analysis starts to become extremely acute. Moreover, a universal can be considered abstractly and as it exists in some particular, in two ways. For example, abstractly, all dry food is good for man. Concretely, this food is dry. This is a man. So while a man might know habitually and actually the abstractly considered universal, that all dry food is good for man, he might not know it as it exists in some particular, in the present, that this food is dry or this is a human being. When considered according to these different actual and habitual, universal and particular, abstract and concrete ways of knowing, what appeared impossible to Socrates appears possible and reasonable. For an incontinent man to have one kind of knowledge and not another appears reasonable. Beyond all the above distinct ways of knowing, St. Thomas adds that knowing by way of habit and act can be understood differently. Sometimes a habit is highly or not highly responsive. It goes into act immediately or slowly or not at all. This happens especially when we act under emotional influence like anger or sexual desire. Such passions generate so much heat that they can cause people to behave crazily. Hence, St. Thomas claims that the incontinent man resembles people asleep, drunkards, and maniacs, people who have practical science impeded regarding particulars. Notice how this impairs their estimative sense. To someone who seeks to object to Aristotle that the incontinent man has an active habit held in check because he uses scientific terminology, Aristotle replies with two examples. Even drunkards and crazed people can mouth demonstrations and cite abstruse material in poetic verse. Even children who start to learn can put together words that sound profound that they do not understand. To understand what we hear, we must in a way become co-naturally part of us, impressed perfectly in the intellectual soul. For this to happen, much time must pass so that by much deliberation, meditation, what is intellectually received is intensely possessed, confirmed in the intellect. This is true even of the incontinent man who can mouth the right words and does not actually hold what he says, pretends this is what he thinks. If we want to understand how the incontinent man can, contrary to his knowledge, say one thing, know the right thing, and do another, the wrong thing, Aristotle says we have to understand the two stages of judging involved in the natural process of practical science. Two judgments constitute an act of practical reason. One universal, known by intellectual reason, like every dishonorable act must be avoided, and particular, known by particular reason, the estimative sense that this act is dishonorable. Since these two acts unite to form one nature of a practical science, these conclusions necessarily follow. If the conclusion of reasoning aimed at is speculative, not practical, the conclusion is drawn and no action ensues. If the conclusion of reasoning aims at generating action, is strictly speaking an act of practical science, the conclusion immediately moves a person to act. If the judgment of universal reason is that we must taste every sweet thing, and the judgment of the estimative sense is that this is sweet, following this flawed reasoning as if it is one of right reason, the temperate man will immediately taste this thing. Analogously, this is the way the temperate man rightly reasons about avoiding doing the dishonorable deed. But it's the way the extremely incontinent man actually reasons, since his reason tells him every pleasure is to be pursued. At this point, the incontinent man on the level of desire intentionally identifies pleasure and good, even though he knows this is false in reality. The moral psychology of the incontinent man is not so morally disordered as that of the intemperate man, St. Thomas says. Before acting by universal reason, the incontinent man knows that not every pleasure is morally good, is to be pursued, that some pleasures are morally evil and should not be pursued, that pleasure and good are not identical. But in the individual circumstance, overwhelmed by intense passion, his reason becomes blinded to the genuine concept of the universal. He cannot clearly see it. His appetite blinds him. So, for example, when his universal practical reason proposes this command, do not eat anything sweet after 8 p.m., his concupiscible appetite proposes that he change that practical negative prescription into this positive universal prescription. Everything sweet should be eaten at all times. This is sweet, eat this. From this, he logically concludes that this is what he's to do. In so doing, he loses touch with reality and common sense. The intemperate man knows the evil he does is against right reason, and this is precisely why he deliberately chooses it, unlike the incontinent man who does it because he's weak. St. Thomas claims that the process of practical reason happening in the way he has described, in the case of the incontinent man, is evident from the fact that concupiscence in the incompetent man so overpowers reason that the incontinent man freely inclines to replace what reason declares with a universal judgment with what the concupiscible appetite declares to be universal. Universal reason in the incontinent man is so weak that it cannot prohibit this change. St. Thomas adds that concupiscence, not reason, causes this opposition, disharmony, inasmuch as concupiscence opposes universal reason. Reason itself never opposes the judgment of right reason. Because brute animals possess no intellectual reason, they cannot make a universal judgment that concupiscence can oppose. Imagination and memory of particulars moves them. They make no distinction between apparent and real goods and evils. To them, all goods, evils are real. St. Thomas proposes the following prescription to cure the ignorance of the incontinent man. Since the incontinent man's ignorance about the particular act involves incorrectly identifying what is or is not the real nature to be considered, recovery of knowledge of reality is the same as the treatment needed for alcoholics and people asleep. Physical change has to happen to put the incontinent man back in touch with reality. Since emotions like anger and concupiscence cause bodily changes that disrupt an ability calmly to sense the real, physiological changes that calm these emotions need to be prescribed. Problems in natural philosophy that St. Thomas says such professionals need to discuss. It's beyond him. Based upon what he has said about universal and particular reasons, St. Thomas says Aristotle is able to refute the argument of Socrates in this way. Particular judgment is made according to sensible knowledge. A directive of action is concerned with particulars. A man under the influence of intense emotion either does not have this particular judgment as a habit, or has a restrained habit that causes him to be blinded to the particular, like an alcoholic repeats profound intellectual sayings. It's true that the man under intense emotion does not know the universal that is known by science. It is true that the universal known by science is not the proximate cause of this person's practical actions. Emotion is not present in the apprehension of universals and is present in the apprehension of the man choosing under intense emotion. The conclusion of Socrates appears to follow in a way. The incontinent man does not knowingly do evil. Having shown that, in a way, a man can knowingly perform evil acts, Aristotle next considers two questions: whether anyone can be incontinent absolutely, without qualification, and if someone can be totally incontinent, regarding what matter can this be so. In short, Aristotle is asking, what is the formal object of the incontinent man? What precisely is it that activates his appetite? He claims that this matter is intense pleasure and pain of touch and taste, food, drink, and sex. To explain how this is so, he observes that among those subjects that cause us pleasure, some are necessary for the preservation of human life. Some are not necessary but are desired for another reason. Among other unnecessary things, he mentions some goods desirable in themselves, like victory, honor, riches, and the like. Regarding such good, Aristotle says that people who pursue them to excess in an inordinate way are not called incontinent absolutely. They are called incontinent by way of likeness relative to these goods. He confirms his claim through an analogous example in which we tend to call soft people who cannot undergo any discomfort, hunger, and thirst. Sort of like most people can endure. Not people who cannot undergo something like poverty, which most of us can endure. Consequently, Aristotle puts the intemperate and the incontinent in the same genus, but he considers them to be specifically different. The intemperate man deliberately chooses excess. The incontinent man does so because emotion overpowers reason. Because the intemperate man knowingly does wrong, he does wrong not under the influence of overpowering emotion. Aristotle says his vice is worse. What would such a person do, he asks, if he were to experience the vehement desires of youth or the serious discomforts that lack of necessities cause? In the following way, Aristotle shows that in the case of unnecessary goods, no absolute incontinence exists. He says three kinds of pleasure exist: some to which we incline by nature, some to which we incline against natural inclination, enabling means that exist between both extremes, to which we incline, like honor, victory, money, and so forth. People who go to excess beyond the measure of right reason about naturally good things, like honor and care of children and parents, are to be in somewhat pitied. Their behavior is not totally blameworthy. Considered in itself, each is naturally desirable and praiseworthy. They become blameworthy only when pursued beyond the measure of right reason and prudence. To explain what he means, Aristotle starts by dividing pleasures into two species, in agreement with natural human inclination and not in agreement with natural human inclination. Some pleasures are naturally delightful to every animal with a particular sense. For example, sweet to animals with the sense of taste. Some pleasures are naturally delightful to different species of animals, like plants to herbivores and animals to carnivores. Some people naturally prefer, by bodily disposition, cold to hot food. Next, before explaining the nature of unnatural pleasures, he says some are delightful because of privation, sickness, or sadness, mental imbalance, vicious nature due to perverse bodily temperament, disordered imaginations and emotions, or habitual disorder. As examples of such unnatural pleasures, Aristotle gives cannibalism, pulling their hair out of their head, eating coal and dirt, homosexuality, and torturing others. He then reduces causes of the preceding to two species: tendency of bodily temperament possessed from birth, and tendency generated through bad childhood habituation. Having identified the preceding unnatural or bestial pleasures, he says that these unnatural pleasures dispose to incontinence in a qualified, partial sense do not totally dispose to incontinence, incontinence absolutely. He states no one will accuse anyone who from birth has such a bestial nature or bad education with being incontinent absolutely and unqualifiedly. St. Thomas adds that bad physical disposition and malignant nature or education resemble, those who have these, resemble people, brute animals, who use no universal judgment and use only imagination and memory of particulars. Hence, just as we do not call brute animals continent and incontinent, since the strongest rational argument will appear weak to them, since little reason exists in them, we should name continent and incontinent and continent in a qualified sense, not absolutely. The very nature of incontinent acts, their basis in bad bodily and emotional dispositions and poor training, inclines Aristotle to say absolute incontinence does not apply to brutish acts. Brutishness exceeds viciousness. Brutish habits are malignant, close to incorrigible, pathological, not ordinary human vice. Some are malignant by nature, by sickness, or by habit. Some oppose all virtues, and some oppose particular virtues. Foolishness opposes prudence, timidity, courage, intemperance, temperance. Barbarians, native peoples, he says, especially incline toward brutishness. Lacking, that is, good laws, is what he's thinking. Having shown for incontinence related in different ways, how incontinence is related in different ways to different pleasures, Aristotle can now compare different species of incontinence to each other. He says absolute, total, complete incontinence concerns matters of touch. Hence, a matter like anger concerns only partial incontinence. He adds that incontinence related to anger is less disgraceful than incontinence in pleasures of touch, incontinence, strictly speaking or absolutely. Using 4 arguments, he proves this claim. To some extent, anger listens to reason because reason tells the angry person to get revenge. Anger causes him to listen poorly because he is not careful to listen to reason about the amount and mode of punishment to inflict. Such a person acts like a servant who hastens to act before hearing all the directions given by a master, or a barking dog who barks at the first sound of someone knocking. The man in incontinent anger under the influence of bodily emotion starts to administer punishment before hearing reason's complete injunction. St. Thomas reports Aristotle's analysis of moral psychology of the angry man in this way. As soon as it's declared delightful to it by reason and sense, sensual desire moves without reasoning to enjoy it. A man who suffers injury and contempt sometimes knows about this immediately from a report of reason, or imagines an injury or slight has happened even though this is not true. Apparently, before reason has time to decide the proper punishment, the man stirs himself by anger, decides to attack, and inflicts improper punishment. St. Thomas explains the reason for the incontinent angry man's behavior as follows. A pleasing object has the nature of an end desirable in itself, is like a principle in reference to a conclusion. Ordinarily, damage to be inflicted on another does not appear as an end. It appears as an enabling means or instrument. To the incontinent man, it appears as an end. The irascible emotion, like anger, inclines to follow reason. A concupiscible desire inclines not to listen to reason unless an irascible emotion can incline it to do so. It inclines to follow its own desires. As a result, the way the sensual appetite inclines to operate, St. Thomas says, something shameful happens in human affairs. The incontinent man in sensual desire is more shameful than the incontinent man acting out of anger because, to some degree, the angry man can listen to reason while the sensually incontinent man cannot. St. Thomas then gives 3 more arguments from Aristotle to show the incontinent man's behavior is more shameful than the angry man's. He gives the first argument as follows: if a man acts imprudently regarding ways of behaving toward human beings, toward which human beings are naturally inclined, like good drink and like food and drink, not fancy food and drink, people are inclined to pardon him. Since anger is more natural and difficult to resist than superfluous and unnecessary pleasures that the intemperate man seeks, we are more inclined to pardon the angry, incontinent man than the intemperate one. The tendency toward anger results from an individual's nature, bodily disposition, emotional disposition. Even though human beings are naturally peaceful, by nature some people are more prone to anger than are others. By nature, a disposition to anger can be inherited, so a man disposed to anger behaves less shamefully than an intemperate man, an intemperate and absolutely incontinent man. His second argument, or the second argument of Aristotle, says that the deceitful men are more unjust than truthful men, and the angry man is truthful. He wants the person being punished to know why he's being punished. Anger does not arise secretly. It arises impulsively. Like the goddess Venus, who binds reason by sensual desire, absolute incontinence binds the judgment of reason in practical matters, tends to work deceitfully, secretively, is more unjust and shameful than the incontinence of anger. Aristotle's third following argument, following the first one, is that no one voluntarily injuring another acts with sadness. The man who acts immediately with anger, however, acts with some sadness as a result of being injured. Acts done with sadness we appear to do involuntarily. The angry man acts somewhat involuntarily, under provocation. If the more unjust act is the one about which we incline to be more angry, and the incontinence of sensual desire inclines to make us more angry, because it is done with pleasure, not sadness, complete voluntariness, not some involuntariness, then the absolutely incontinent act of sensual desire, by doing more unjust of an act, is more shameful than the partially incontinent act of the incontinent man. St. Thomas summarizes Aristotle's conclusion about the incontinence thus: continence and incontinence, in an unqualified sense, concern sensual pleasures related to the sense of touch and taste, senses of touch and taste. Such incontinence is more shameful than the qualified incontinence related to anger. Comparing human incontinence to brutishness, he says, temperance and intemperance concern sensual desires natural to humans. Absolutely considered, we do not call brutes temperate and intemperate. We do call some animals more unclean, stupid, voracious, rapacious than others. In contrast to these, we call some animals temperate and imprudent by a kind of likeness to human temperance and prudence. Insane people who have lost their reason are like this, but strictly speaking, temperance and intemperance do not exist in brutes and brutish men. Considering the animal condition of brutes and the brutish condition of incontinent men, brutes are less evil than and more frightening than brutish men. While brutish animals might cause more physical damage, the brutishness of a vicious man is more to be dreaded and more morally blameworthy. After discussing continence and incontinence in detail, he discusses in detail with temperance and intemperance. He compares these in detail with temperance and intemperance by first noting that they share the same formal object and deal with the subject of chief intent. Intense physical pleasures and pain related to the faculties of touch and taste. Both the temperate and continent man are strong-souled, persevering, able to resist temptations. Their acts relate to intense physical pleasures of touch and taste. The intemperate and incontinent are weak-souled and soft concerning the same matters. The intense physical pleasures with which temperance and continence deal relate to necessary, real, not apparent goods, goods essentially connected to self and species preservation. While such physical goods are necessary up to a point of quantitative, virtual, discrete greatness, beyond that point they can cause damage to possession and preservation of life and health. Because the concupiscible appetite is not directly inclined to listen to reason, tends to cling to its object as an end in itself. It inclines not to feel shame and guilt, is not an enabling useful good and means. Hence, the intemperate man who intentionally plans to ignore reason tends not to experience shame and embarrassment, sorrow, guilt, or remorse about the base pleasures he has sought, tends to have no conscience. The man who is insensitive to pleasure, intemperate by defect of being able to feel no pleasure, also deviates from the middle course of the temperate man. The incontinent man differs from the temperate man because this man is inclined to take direction from prudentially guided reason, but apparently is too weak, irresolute to do so. Appetitively, that is too weak to do so. He experiences shame and embarrassment, guilt, remorse, sorrow, has a conscience. The intemperate man tends to be dispassionately wicked in the pursuit of intense pleasures, pathologically wicked. The incontinent man tends to be emotionally weak, delicate. The intemperate man tends cold-bloodedly to seek shameful, intense pleasures. About him, Aristotle asks, what might a man sinning do, this man sinning do, if he were passionate? He delights in being imprudent, with no passion, by deliberate choice. The continent man can contain, restrain intense emotion. The incontinent person cannot. Resembles a slave being beaten by a master. But the continent man must struggle, persevere, somewhat to do so. The continent and the persevering man are not identical because while he still struggles somewhat, the continent man has mastered the pleasure and pain with which he struggles. The persevering man has not yet achieved marginal victory, is still on the way to it, struggles to hold his ground. Still, the continent man is not totally victorious, temperate. The incontinent man is soft, strong, not strong-souled, small, not great-souled, weak in intensive quantity, strength of soul. While the incontinent man still struggles greatly against intense pleasures and pains, he's better than the man no longer able to persevere, the sad sack, the wretch, who can no longer endure pain, work, hardship, or difficulties. While the intemperate man might be thought to be more inclined to pursue amusement, this is more the inclination, Aristotle says, of the incontinent man, the person we'd call a class clown, who seeks emotional outlets of pleasure, a relaxation, rest, to distract him from the self-awareness of his pain of failure, sense of guilt and shame. According to Aristotle, two species of incontinence exist: impetuous and impulsive, emotional softness and emotional softness. Impetuousness, impulsiveness cannot wait to reason, to deliberate. They are found in the angry and the depressed incontinent, people who have considered themselves failures. The emotionally soft, appetitively can wait for reason, but is unable to take good advice. Note how for Aristotle, the concupiscible emotions, the irascible emotions, directly relate to pleasure. The concupiscible directly relate to pleasurable, not useful goods. The irascible directly relate to instrumental and useful goods that help perfect performance activities. Aristotle considers ethics to be chiefly concerned with emotional appetitive education, proximately achieved through the estimative sense. This becomes clear by studying him. As he sees it, the estimative sense inclines by nature under the influence of prudence, to use the emotions of the irascible appetite to restrain, educate, train, and moderate the concupiscible emotions of pleasure and pain, so that it can then employ them to perfect its own natural inclination to take direction from and execute the commands of universal reason. Education in continence is the chief appetitive tool of moral education, as Aristotle sees it. It helps the courageous, the just, the temperate to take pleasure in being prudentially guided in performing acts that involve hope, fear, daring, and overcoming dangers and difficulties in individual situations. Dealing with continence and incontinence. Continence being a moral state closely resembling virtue, but not quite making it. In discussing this in the beginning of the last video, I presented a lot of arguments that Aristotle made to criticize positions that might object to the teachings he was presenting, and I went over those fairly quickly because Aristotle says that we need to do this, answer objections, because this is a scientific procedure, and it helps to confirm for people that want to question whether we know what we're talking about scientifically, that we actually do. I didn't want to dwell on those because by the time we finish this whole discussion, this psychological analysis is so fantastic that doing so would take away from that. And if you go back over those arguments as I presented them, I went over them with a speed adequately enough, I thought, so that in a second or third read, if you focused on them, you could understand them, you could follow them. I'd much rather concentrate on his arguments and is related to the nature of temperance and intemperance, continence and incontinence, which he's engaging in at the moment and at the latter part of the last lecture. So here we go again. Chiefly because the intemperate man voluntarily refuses deliberately to listen to reason, to right reason and to prudence, Aristotle considers him to be, and he is educationally incorrigible in the area of morals, Aristotle considers him to be morally worse than the incontinent man. While both choose bodily pleasures as their chief end and cannot clearly see real human goods of virtue like courage, temperance, wisdom, and justice, they can't clearly recognize them, at least in the most intense intemperate stages. The incontinent man readily repents, experiences sorrow after the intense pleasure subsides, whereas the intemperate man delights in his imprudent lifestyle and increasingly becomes more brutish. For this reason, incontinence is more curable and intemperance more difficult to cure, according to Aristotle. Incontinence resembles a short, intense illness. Intemperance resembles a long, incurable one. Intemperance and incontinence belong to different genera and orders of moral acts. The reason for this is that intemperance is a fixed vice. Incontinence is not. A fixed vice does not appear to be a vice to the vicious man. It deceives a vicious person into thinking that what he desires, the choices he makes, are really good. This self-deception is not present in the incontinent man, at least not in the extremely incontinent one. The incontinent man is still in his right mind, still possesses common sense, knows that the apparent good that attracts him is not really good, is really evil. Some hidden evil is morally worse than since hidden evil is morally worse than overt evil. The intemperate man is worse than the incontinent man. Hence, incontinence is a quasi-vice, just as continence is almost a virtue, while intemperance is full-fledged vice, according to Aristotle. The intemperate man can and does reflect in advance and can act in a self-controlled way, but takes pleasure in disobeying right reason. The incontinent man who sins out of poor bodily condition, poor emotional disposition, is more to be pitied, helped, than blamed, does something vicious, but not in the way the vicious person does. Repents because he knows that pursuing bodily pleasures against the command of right reason is really harmful. In contrast, because of his wicked habit, the intemperate man is convinced that the bestial pleasures he pursues constitute good in itself, happiness. The incontinent person is habitually unconvinced that what he chooses is right. In the sphere of moral education, Aristotle says, vice destroys and virtue preserves. Knowledge of the end. The chief principle of moral action for the sake of which we engage in free acts. In practical activity, the end, the last act to be done, is analogous to first principles of speculative reasoning in speculative science. knowledge of such principles cannot be taught by argument. It is induced by nature or practice, by the habit of virtue naturally known or learned by custom. We acquired right estimation. Notice, right estimation of the ends to be pursued. The incontinent man momentarily exceeds the limits of right reason. Through repentance, though, returns to the limit of right estimation, right reasoning, in determining the end. Because reasoning presupposes, cannot teach the principles it assumes. People who, like the intemperate man, make mistakes about principles cannot be corrected by appeal to reason, cannot be corrected easily at all. Not being amenable to being penitent, feeling sorrow, shame, he cannot be educated until the bad habit is destroyed. Hence the temperate man is the right measure regarding the mean and end regarding matters involving intense bodily pleasures and pains. In Lesson 9 of his commentary on Book 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics, St. Thomas says, where he's dealing with the continent versus the obstinate man, Aristotle starts to settle the precise question of what sort of species continence is. He begins settling this issue by saying he abides by every right principle and choice, the continent man, and hence to right reason and virtue, following the mean of right reason. Next, St. Thomas considers a question raised by Aristotle about whether any of the following is continent or incontinent. Someone who abides by any principle or choice, whatever, whether good or bad, whether that person is continent. Somebody abides by no principle or choice is continent. Whether a person who abides by right principles or choice is continent, and whether a person who abides by a wrong principle is continent. Aristotle answers that a man who abides by any principle whatever is strictly speaking not continent. Continent incidentally, perhaps, because we name a person properly from what he chiefly aims to choose. The continent person must chiefly aim to choose the good. The proper object of any appetitive faculty is the good it essentially desires. What is outside direct desire of intention is desired incidentally. A man who adheres to a true reason is essentially continent. He who adheres to a false reason, thinking it is true, is continent incidentally, only partially, not totally and absolutely, like the truly continent man. Unreasonably obstinate, strongly opinionated people resemble continent people. Aristotle explains their difference by first considering the two ways that exist to change a person's opinion: on the part of reason, with a better reason, or by swaying emotion. The continent man's opinion tends to be swayed by reason, not emotion, by rational judgment, especially in practical matters. The obstinate man's opinion tends to be swayed by emotion, especially by irrational pleasures. Being intellectually undisciplined, unreceptive to be taught by anyone, obstinate people tend to be unable to entertain anyone else's opinion, love when they win arguments, and hate when they are proved wrong. They more resemble the incontinent than the continent man. Aristotle next notes that sometimes abandoning a principle, a wrong or a weak one, is good and worthy of praise if we have the wrong principle. He adds that not everyone who pursues pleasures is evil, incontinent, intemperate. Only the man who pursues shameful pleasures is properly named by those terms. Next, Aristotle shows how continence is related to virtue by pursuing a mean. He says that sometimes someone enjoys physical pleasure not for a virtuous end, but out of disgust, less than he should. He resembles the insensitive man. He enjoys it not in accord with right reason, which sees pleasure as a human good. The continent man constitutes the mean between the insensible man by defect and the incontinent man by excess, the impetuous or weak incontinent person. He resembles the temperate man in this mean between, the intemperate by defect and the intemperate by excess, being concupiscible. He says that excess and defect of continence relate to moral good and evil. From his discussion, Aristotle concludes that since excess and defect do not adhere to right reason, and continence adheres to right reason, continence is a good, a mean between two bad habits of excess and defect. He also notes that continence and temperance are not recognized to be means between extremes, because the defective extreme of insensibility rarely happens. Few people are rarely not attracted to pleasures. He adds that extremes are opposed to continence in two ways. From the side of reason, excess of reason, obstinacy is to continence like prodigality is to generosity. A defect of reason is instability. The mean of continence does not vacillate. From the side of desire, restraining too much, having no desire for pleasure, and restraining too little, having evil desires that attract, are extremes from the side of ends. The temperate man does not have the incontinent man's end, evil desires, like the temperate man. The continent man is not seduced by evil desires. The temperate man is not delighted contrary to reason. Sometimes the continent man is, but is not seduced by these. Finally, Aristotle compares and contrasts incontinence and intemperance by saying, both pursue intense bodily pleasures. They differ in that the intemperate man thinks this is good to do, while the incontinent man does not, knows it's bad, and regrets it. Note what Aristotle does throughout this Nicomachean Ethics, how from a scientific standpoint he compares the parts of moral activity throughout the Nicomachean Ethics, of one part to another. One virtue to another virtue, a vice to another vice, much like someone who has a masterful understanding of baseball, if he possessed in a scientific way, would be able to tell you what a second baseman does in relationship to a left fielder, center fielder, right fielder, pitcher, catcher, so on. Every person on a team with respect to the managers, the coaches, and so forth. And could do that with every player on the team. That masterful ability to take all the parts of a whole and compare their relationships one to each other and what they contribute to the operation of a whole is what Aristotle and St. Thomas considered to be science. And to my mind, that is much more masterful than the deprived understanding of science to which we've become reduced in the modern times, which identifies it with empirical testing of hypotheses. There's no comparison. Continuing in lesson 10 with Aristotle's analysis of the prudent and the incontinent man, St. Thomas starts Aristotle's solution to the question, can prudence coexist with incontinence? Using two arguments, Aristotle proves it cannot. One, prudence accompanies moral virtue. The prudent person is morally good because the emotions of the incontinent man are morally seducing, imprudent. The incontinent man has no moral virtue. Prudence essentially involves knowledge and judging, practice and commanding. The incontinent man fails in practice and commanding, but not totally in knowledge. Aristotle next gives a reason why apparently prudent people are incontinent. They are only apparently prudent. They are shrewd and clever. People who have a reputation for being prudent, even though strictly speaking, they are not. Incontinent people who are especially shrewd greatly resemble prudent people. Nonetheless, the prudent and the incontinent man differ in these ways. Both appear to reason correctly. Only the prudent man can execute. The incontinent man reasons speculatively and poorly. But not practically and well, has a deficient estimative sense faculty. That is, the incontinent man tends to consider his universal principle tends to be reduced almost to a speculative one, huh? The universal of reason, huh? And if it's practical in the sense that it's commanding practical activity, not as a negative, but as a positive. Actually, the incontinent man does not habitually know thoroughly, does not habitually speculate well about the individual circumstances of an act. Huh? He lacks common sense. He resembles a dreamer, a drunkard, someone in whom the habit of reasoning in touch with reality has been suspended. In a general way, he knows the circumstances of an act, but he chooses somewhat willingly, voluntarily, is not a bad person because not every voluntary act is an act of choice, a deliberate act. When passion does not overwhelm him, his choice is good, equitable, he means well, his choice crumbles, however, and he wills evil once intense passion is presented. Huh? The prudent and incontinent man differ chiefly in relationship to deliberate choice. The prudent man's choice is deliberate, uncorrupted. The incontinent man's choice is voluntary, but corrupted in the deliberating process. Now, once again, through weakness of will, as St. Thomas had pointed out. Consequently, the incontinent man is partly bad, not absolutely evil or unjust, is not an evil-doing schemer, a con man, deliberately evil, in the premeditated way like an intemperate man. One species of the incontinent man is impulsive, impetuous, highly sensitive emotionally, and in another extreme, sad and melancholy, a person given to anger on the one hand and to regret on the other. He cannot deliberate at all or listen to good counsel in some respect. Huh? Sometimes he can deliberate, but not deliberate well. Sometimes can not deliberate at all and cannot listen to good counsel in either case. Huh? Another species is a weak deliberator, a dreamer who lacks resolve, again, who cannot take good counsel, who is prone to laziness, timidity in the face of labor. Having compared and contrasted continence and incontinence, Aristotle concludes that the specific difference they share relative to intense pleasure of taste and touch is chiefly in the will, not in the emotions. The continent man is strong-willed. The incontinent man is weak-willed. The continent man voluntarily chooses rightly. The incontinent man voluntarily chooses wrongly. He compares the incontinent man to a city that plans intelligently, arranges everything logically necessary, has good laws, is unable to follow any of its laws. You might compare this to a bad business also. People in business should think about this. He says the incontinent man is incapable of using the right reason he has. In contrast, the intemperate man, using perverse reason, resembles a city observing bad laws that does not deserve good laws. The continent man follows a mean of right reason, greater in intensity than the majority of men, and less than that of the prudent man. The majority of men, Aristotle says, do not have the habit of right reason because they do not master sensual pleasures. Note, right reason as defined by Aristotle in relationship to ethics is chiefly done in relationship to the concupiscible appetite. The incontinent man abides by right reason less than the majority of men because he cannot overcome the sensual desires that most men can. Of the two kinds of incontinence, St. Thomas says that the impetuous kind is easier to cure because the weak kind is more dominated by influence of pleasure, and because the impetuous kind is more dominated by anger, which has an inclination to listen to reason. That's also my addition. St. Thomas doesn't give the explanation, nor does Aristotle. St. Thomas starts lesson 11 with Aristotle's discussion of the need for the political philosopher to study pleasure and pain. Because just as that political science is the chief science, is the chief division of moral science, the whole of a science is reducible to its chief science because it contains its first principles. And just as the end of the master science measures and commands, controls all the arts of the lower arts, So pleasure, which is the end of political science, is the chief principal matter of moral science. In a way, pleasure and human happiness are identical for Aristotle. In any art, the principal end is the rule, the chief subject of consideration, that to which all other activities are referred as making them intelligible and desirable. In ethics, political science, habits and actions are measured, good and bad, relative to their intensive qualitative greatness of pleasure desired. The higher the quality of the pleasure is the measure. Note, the end of the master art is the good of maximum greatness of intensive quantity, the highest good, the perfect and the beautiful good. That is the most pleasurable good, the good of greatest qualitative satisfaction. As such, it must please. The virtuous man is pleased by doing good deeds, intrinsically pleasing acts, beautiful deeds. The vicious man is pleased by doing evil deeds. Because the duty, the job of the moral philosopher is to investigate virtue and vice, principles attracted to that recognize the beautiful in act, that which pleases when perceived, the beautiful quality of acts, their harmonization relative to an end, the job of the moral philosopher is to investigate pleasure and pain, and with it, to some extent, apparently beauty. St. Thomas notes, to a great extent that is, St. Thomas notes that the many among the Greeks and Aristotle, the learned, connect happiness, beatus, translated in Latin, with pleasure, derived from the verb to rejoice exceedingly. Aristotle presents the teachings of the philosophers who claim no connection exists between pleasure and good. He claims if a pleasurable thing is good, pleasure and good are not identical. While some pleasures are good, most are evil, and even if all pleasures are good, none can be the highest good. These four popular claims made by some philosophers. He then details these claims. He presents 6 arguments in favor of these 4 opinions. The first argument is taken from a definition of pleasure as an experienced process of movement of the senses toward a natural end. Aristotle finds that definition deficient. He'll show that later on. When something connatural to us is produced in us, these philosophers claim, we delight in it. No such process belongs to the genus of ends, the genus of being completed. It belongs to the genus of means, becoming built. The good has the nature of the end, and therefore no pleasure is the good, because the good has the nature of a means. No one is praised. This second argument continues. For avoiding good, the temperate man, however, is praised as virtuous, and for avoiding pleasure. So pleasure cannot be a good. The prudent man seeks freedom from pain, an imperfect kind of pleasure, so he seeks freedom from pleasure, another sophistic argument that these people present. Since pain is not good, apparently, supposedly, neither is pleasure. Further, no good impedes prudence. Pleasure, and the more so intense pleasure, impede prudence to the point of not simultaneously being able to exercise the acts of pleasure and understanding, that is prudence. In short, prudence and pleasure cannot coexist. Pleasure cannot be a good. Every human good is the product of some art. Pleasure is the product of no art. Pleasure, therefore, is no good. A 5th argument maintains. And the 6th argument says, what is pursued by the childish and animal and man is shameful, not good. The childish and animal and man pursues pleasure, and so pleasure is not good. Finally, in sum, even if all pleasures are good, no pleasure is the highest good, because the end is the best. Pleasure is a process, a means to an end, and not the highest good. Note, once again, that Aristotle is going to reject that claim. that pleasure is a process. Having stated the 6 arguments favoring the philosopher's claims about the relation of pleasure and good as them being distinct, Aristotle refutes them, starts to refute them by saying, the arguments advanced do not really prove that pleasure is not good, is not the very best thing. In fact, they don't even understand, properly speaking, the nature of pleasure. That's their problem. He starts to refute them by saying that by distinguishing 2 ways of being good, absolutely and relative to some individual. By nature and according to habits, Aristotle says all things are ordered to good absolutely and relative to some individual. Because movements, generations, proceeds from particular natures and habits, they must be related to the natures and the habits that generate them in some way. In the same way, some good habits, some good absolutely, some good for a particular individual. On the supposition that pleasures are movements, processes, 4 kinds of pleasure exist according to Aristotle. Some good absolutely, as pleasures in virtuous works, others absolutely bad, although by reason of some necessity, for example, medicine, is desirable for a particular individual who is sick. The still others, not chosen by anyone consistently over a long period, chosen inconsistently for a short time. For example, taking food rarely to prevent death. People who have a kind of psychological disorder that would cause them to refuse to eat, for example. And counterfeit pleasures because of a sickly disposition in which a person delights to engage in peculiar kinds of acts in order to relieve pain, like twisting and turning in bed, taking bitter food. He makes a second distinction about 2 ways of being good, as an activity, contemplation, and as a habit. The habit he's talking about is a formative habit, which might confuse you as you read, trying to understand what he's talking about. The formative habit appears to be imperfect because it is an initial perfection. An activity appears to be perfect good because it's an additional perfection. In other words, the habit has not completely organized the nature in habit formation. Consequently, genuine and perfect pleasure is found in the good that consists in an activity, is generated by a perfect whole. Most people identify pleasure with as imperfect activity, the actions, the movements that produce a natural formative habit, but these are only incidentally good. They are habit formation habits, like doing the hard work to develop a skill, virtue, or science. These are certainly pleasurable, but they are not pleasurable, properly speaking, in the most perfect sense. A natural formative habit is a good that generates a habit. The pleasurable activity that derives from habit formation habits, doing the work needed to acquire a skill, is not as pleasurable as the pleasure experienced by exercising the skill. If it were, the subsequent pleasure would add nothing to the former. Habit formation habits are imperfectly pleasurable, accompanied by pain. With pain, a man covets the pleasure derived from performing acts of virtuous habits, a pleasure of higher quality, higher intensive quantity, greatness. A pleasurable activity accompanied by a desire for a pleasure of a higher quality does not belong to a perfect habit. It's not perfect pleasure. It proceeds from a natural or dispositional principle accompanied by pain. Not without pain do we desire a natural perfection we do not yet have, a pleasure unaccompanied by pain and further desire due to their imperfection. Not all pleasures are of this perfect quality. It's obvious from pleasures that accompany contemplation such pleasures exist. Not only that, not simply from contemplation, but from the pleasure that comes from complete possession of an athletic ability, an athletic skill, or a business ability, of any kind of virtue or skill. A bodily natural need being satisfied does not generate such pleasures. Perfection, satisfaction of reason causes them. That is, pleasures of contemplation. Pleasures connected with virtue formation habits are pleasures in an imperfect manner and sense. They are not pleasures in a perfect sense, the maximum sense, proceeding from perfect, beautiful, organizational, perfect wholes. You have the perfect business, you have the perfect corporation, the perfect operation, and you execute it perfectly. That's really pleasurable. If such pleasures were completely and maximally enjoyable, they would be so under any condition. Pleasures, pleasures that help and assist habits and natures maturely to develop into complete wholes and perfect wholes are incomplete pleasures. A gored nature present in a man, a gluttonous eating habit, who overdoes eating, and a temperate nature do not experience the same kind of pleasure. They're qualitatively different. Nature, habit, properly controlled by right reason, delights in things really life-promoting, protecting, and healthy to enjoy for human nature specifically and individually. People with a healthy diet enjoy pungent and bitter-tasting foods, St. Thomas observed, that act as dietary supplements that help digestion. Gluttons do not. As more perfectly enjoyable things, good, are enjoyed, are compared, so are the pleasures they cause. Things that can be enjoyed with greater quality and intensive quantity are such pleasures. Having established the principles needed to refute the false teachings of some philosophers related to good and pleasure, Aristotle starts to do so by saying, no need exists to consider pleasure as a process, a coming to be, a state of being, is more perfect than a state of becoming, because these people conceived of a state of being, in the wrong state. Some philosophers mistakenly concluded that they had to exclude pleasure entirely as a highest good, because a good better than pleasure had to exist, they thought. Not all pleasures are processes accompanied by some process. Habit formation pleasures are processes, pleasures of means. Some pleasures are activities, pleasures of ends, complete perfection that accompany being whole. They come from virtuous use, not from virtuous formation. They do not arise as pleasures that come from forming habits. They come from the exercise of already formed perfect habits, good habits, as essential properties always accompanying their exercise. The first argument that defines pleasure as an experience process is wrong. It defines pleasure as imperfect. More properly understood, defined, pleasure is the connatural activity of an already formed, perfect habit, a virtue. Instead of an experienced process, better to call it an unimpeded one. Hence, most properly understood and defined, St. Thomas calls pleasure an unimpeded activity of a habit that is a natural harmonizing with the nature of its possessor. Such an impediment to operation causes difficulty in operation. It prevents pleasure. Since some philosophers mistakenly identify good chiefly with generation, coming to be, not with what is principally is, a completely generated being, a developed whole, they mistakenly concluded that pleasure is a kind of process, an operation activity that originates from a completed nature, not yet completed, in the process. It's a movement in process. Pleasure, in the most proper sense, according to St. Thomas, accompanies action, is connatural with it. He disposes the second objection, that even if a pleasurable thing is good, pleasure and good are not identical, by saying the reason some philosophers held this was because they recognized that at times some pleasurable goods lead to evil. If this were true, we would have to say that some helpful things are evil because they cost money. Regarding the prudent man, seeking freedom from pleasure, considering pleasure evil, St. Thomas replies, the connatural pleasure of every habit facilitates, does not impede its proper operation. Pleasures alien to connatural pleasures impede virtuous perfect operation of a habit. Hence, pleasures that accompany investigating learning cause us to learn more. Regarding the false claim that pleasure is the product of no art, St. Thomas argues, properly speaking, pleasure accompanies activity, not process. Art chiefly generates process, a plan of action, a right plan for producing something. Art does not have the power directly to cause activity. It has the power directly to cause the power, the principles from which activity arises. So indirectly it causes pleasure. Like by making perfume, for example, or making utensils by means of which you can cook. Consequently, art is the remote, not the proximate cause of pleasure, of the means that cause pleasure, like the art of cooking or perfumery. The fact that the temperate man, that the prudent man seeks a life free of pain, and that children and dumb animals seek pleasures, do not prove that pleasure and good are not identical, because pleasures and goods can be considered absolutely and unqualifiedly, or relatively and qualifiedly. Some pleasures are good absolutely by nature for all human beings. Other pleasures are good for particular individuals, depending upon their individual bodily constitution and condition, their psychological condition, and external circumstances. Physical pleasures of this or that person, accompanied by pleasure and pain, are not good absolutely considered. From their excess we become intemperate. Hence, a temperate man avoids them. Other pleasures proper to a temperate man he seeks and delights in. According to Aristotle, properly speaking, not only is pleasure a human good, one pleasure is the highest good, happiness. He starts to prove this by saying that everyone admits that pain is bad to be avoided, and twofold: evil absolutely, unqualifiedly in every way, and evil relatively, qualifiedly in a way. Evil relatively is a hindrance to good, hinders the soul from doing good. Just as evil and good are contrary opposites, so are pain and pleasure. Pleasure opposes pain as good to evil. Speusippus was wrong, according to Aristotle, to claim that pain is opposed to pleasure as greater to less evil, as one extreme evil to another, both pleasure and pain being evil. According to Aristotle, this teaching maintains that pleasure is evil in its own nature, is absolutely evil, something no one can plausibly hold. While the Platonist, Aristotle says, held that pleasure is not a good, is an obstacle to good, something imperfect, they never held pleasure to be evil absolutely and considered in itself. I don't think that's an accurate teaching, by the way, of Plato. Plato holds that pleasure, as it's attracted to material things, is evil, but not to the invisible, not to the immaterial, as far as I understand him, and I think correctly. According to Aristotle, one pleasure must be the highest good, because even though some pleasures appear to be evil, and might conclude from this, and we might conclude from this that pleasure is not the best of goods, this does not preclude pleasure from being the highest good. Because considering an analogy, because if you consider that because of some defect they have on the part of their principles or on the part of their subjects, some sciences are bad, are not a perfect being, are not as perfect as a science can be. This in no way precludes a highest science, metaphysics, from existing. So Aristotle gives this analogy and says that you can't conclude that there can't be a highest good simply because there is a good associated with a certain activity that is deficient on a lower scale. Some unimpeded activity exists within every habit. Happiness is an unimpeded activity of all good habit or of one good habit. Unimpeded activities of this kind are desirable in themselves as ends, not as means to some further activity or as part of a process. Pleasure is an unimpeded activity. As an unimpeded activity, a highest pleasure in which happiness exists and is desirable in itself, not as a means to some higher good, but it's a pleasure identified with absolutely as an end. Happiness is both an unimpeded activity and an activity that causes pleasure. Everyone actually thinks that the happy life is the pleasurable, the delightful life. Understandably connects pleasure and happiness, because happiness is perfect activity, and no perfect activity contains imperfection and an impediment. For happiness not to contain pleasure appears ridiculous. Happiness is an unimpeded activity. As unimpeded, it causes pleasure. Pleasure accompanies it as a property. Because happiness is unimpeded activity, it requires all the enabling means for exceeding unimpeded action. Bodily goods like general health, lack of injuries, external goods it needs, called goods of fortune. Strictly speaking, the Stoics and others like them say that even when tossed about and overcome by great misfortune, a virtuous man is happy. Aristotle says to talk in such a way is nonsense. Because happiness demands good fortune, some philosophers considered happiness and good fortune to be identical. Because too much wealth, good fortune hinges us from doing acts of virtue, often makes us lazy, and happiness consists in performing acts of virtue. Superabundance of wealth, good luck, should not be called good fortune, because the measure of real good fortune is established by comparison to real happiness, to the real end of human nature. Because the opinion of the many cannot be totally wrong, and the many hold that pleasure is the highest good. Some indication exists that Aristotle is right in his claim that nature does not fail in most cases. That which is found in most people appears to arise from nature, which inclines to generate nothing false and evil, although sometimes it does. In reply to a possible criticism that what all men admit happiness consists in, pleasure, and a highest pleasure, different people disagree about the nature of this pleasure. Aristotle says, according to natural, species-specific desire, all men desire the same pleasure as happiness. According to individual judgments, choices, this differs. It appears to them differently. By nature, all human beings identify the same pleasure with the highest contemplation of rational truth, inasmuch as all men desire to know and excel at knowing the truth. The reason for this is that all men have in them a divinely implanted inclination, derived from God, St. Thomas says, and or their substantial form to know truth, much like he said in his work on the Compendium of Theology. Many people, even philosophers, do not recognize this because the many do not tend to experience contemplative pleasures and have reduced the term pleasure to their narrow understanding of it, because bodily pleasures are the ones most commonly experienced and need to be satisfied to live, and most easily known to us. Finally, the happy life might not be, finally, strictly speaking, if pleasure and pleasurable activity are not good, absolutely, the happy life might not be pleasant. Living in pain might not be evil and something to be avoided. If the virtuous man is not, if virtuous activities are not essentially pleasurable, which is false, then producing good, if the life of the virtuous man, the activity is not essentially pleasurable, then producing good and virtue would appear to produce no pleasure. Having considered pleasure and pain in general, Aristotle next talks about physical pleasures. He talks about these in relationship to continence and incontinence. He starts by saying that some people claim that some bodily pleasures are especially worthy of choice, and some intemperate ones are not. According to Aristotle, bodily pleasures are good inasmuch as they drive away opposing pains, obstacles, impediments, but not absolutely, but in some respect, because every bodily pleasure is caused by some bodily movement, activity, or habit. If in a habit a superabundance of the better, too much good, cannot exist, neither can an excess of pleasure, too much pleasure. No excess of good, for example, can exist in contemplation of the truth. The more we contemplate the truth, the better we become, qualitatively greater pleasure we experience. Everyone desires bodily pleasures up to a physical maximum beyond which we suffer personal damage. But in the case of contemplation of truth, we never become personally damaged or harmed by continuing pursuit of contemplative pleasure. We blame people for not experiencing bodily pleasures even at times. The foregoing arguments show that up to a point bodily pleasure is good. We do not call a man evil because he wants bodily pleasures. We call him evil because he wants them to excess, to a point beyond which they damage him, harm his health or life. Pain has a different influence on us. While we rightly avoid some good, it has a different influence on us than pleasure. While we rightly avoid some good, we rightly avoid all pain as evil. Absolutely considered, Aristotle says, no pain is good. Even a man of virtue, St. Thomas maintains, flees absolutely all pain. Pain then cannot be the contrary opposite of excessive physical pleasure. It's often the effect of it. If it were, we would only flee excessive pain, physical pain, and not all pain. Pain would be something, in some cases, to be tolerated, not to be totally shunned. Some people, however, the incontinent, are pained by a minuscule absence of privation of the pleasurable. Moreover, excess of physical pleasures are bad because they cause pain, from which by nature we are inclined to flee. According to Aristotle and St. Thomas, more discussion is needed to explain why, even though bodily pleasures appear to the many to be qualitatively greater than intellectual ones, the contrary opposite is true. Intellectual pleasures are good absolutely. Bodily pleasures are only good to some extent. Aristotle says that one reason intense physical pleasure is desirable is because by its intensity it drives out pain. Hence, to protect themselves from pain, some men seek an abundance of intense bodily pleasures. In other words, one pain is considered good with respect to another because it, or a pleasure is considered good with respect to a pain because it drives it out. Because intellectual pleasure is perfect pleasure, strictly speaking, no intellectual pain opposes intellectual pleasure as a contrary opposite. And this needs no explanation. Apparently, as Plato and Aristotle and St. Thomas sees it, but I think it does need some explanation. Because they appear to be talking absolutely considered, because it's perfect pleasure absolutely considered. No intellectual pleasure absolutely considered opposes it. Pain is a privation of pleasure, just as evil is a privation of good. Hence, people who are deprived of food drink more intensely and more pleasurably, and as well when they're thirsty, as people who do when they're thirsty. St. Thomas gives the example of a person eating salty things in order to build up the intensity of the pleasure of thirst, satisfying it, because two kinds of bodily pleasures exist. To some people, bodily pleasure considered as such appears to be evil. Some bodily pleasures are naturally evil, as harmful. Some appear as naturally desirable to some beings, like brute animals and brutish men. Other pleasures are naturally good, are medicinal remedies for physical defects. These belong to someone in natural need, like food to a hungry man. While to be already perfect is better than to become perfect, medicinal pleasures are needed by those being perfected, but not needed by the already perfect. Such pleasures are not absolutely good, but incidentally good, useful goods for a time. Since physical pleasures are not good as physical, but good as life-enhancing, medicinal, some people conclude they are not good at all. Because they excel the proper measure of right reason, some vehement bodily pleasures are not medicinal, or morally evil. Because by nature human beings seek the intense pleasure of a qualitatively different kind of joy than bodily pleasures can cause. And because they lack the proper habituation to enjoy intellectual pleasures that generate such joy, St. Thomas maintains that some people unwittingly attempt to satisfy their desire for such pleasures by using artificial stimulants like recreational use of something like drink, or we would include today like drugs. Since these people do not have the spiritual resources to secure those other forms of intense delight, St. Thomas says to enjoy such pleasures is not so bad, so long as they do not hurt themselves or others through reprehensible acts like committing adultery or eating poisonous food. In addition, by nature we need recreational pleasure as a remedy for painful work. As physical scientists will confirm, natural movements involved in physical labor cause stress, especially to the sensitive, and of itself work tires the body. Even constant seeing and hearing can physically strain and fatigue the organs of sight and hearing. Hence animals need to sleep to rest and relax. Because by nature we delight in seeing and hearing, to know, sometimes we do not recognize the damage that comes from intensity in these activities, sustained use. Because of their body chemistry related to growth, young men especially seek pleasure, resemble alcoholics in bodily disturbance. Emotionally depressed people also have a constant medicinal need for pleasure. Because their depression toxifies the body, this need is often intense. Hence, depressed people often become intemperate, brutish. Because intellectual pleasures cause none of these negative side effects, they serve as a natural and proper, not incidental medicinal remedy for such pain. Incidental remedies, pleasures, please, inasmuch as they cure, returning a person to a healthy condition. When such incidental remedies are sought outside their medicinal need, they cause harm. Natural remedies of intellectual virtue do not cause such harm. Human nature is not simple, unchanging, St. Thomas says. It's composite, constantly attracted to different things, constantly deteriorating. As a result, if we do one action pleasurable to one of our parts, this pleasure often causes pain in another. Consequently, the pleasures of contemplation that are naturally desirable to man's intellectual faculty transcend the natural power of the imagination, especially so for most human beings. Hence, contemplation is not always enjoyable to us. Nonetheless, St. Thomas says, if man were only an intellect like God, he would always take pleasure in contemplation, even in a state of immobility. Indeed, because it's unimpeded by the imperfection of motion, the pleasure produced without motion in our intellect is greater and at rest in contemplation than the imperfect pleasure of process. The human intellect even now experiences such pleasure because by nature men change. We tend to delight in pleasures involved with change, even though these are imperfect.